Hello again and welcome to the third of our conference sessions. We are now looking at connecting our way to a bigger picture, and I'm delighted to welcome Kim Baldacchino to lead us through this. Kim says that she undertook the course, the Oxford University undergraduate diploma in local history, and this completely changed the way she viewed local history and one-place studies and the way that she's combined information to make different links. She, again, is a founder, member and former committee member of the Society. She was our first webmaster and continues to use her IT skills as the webmaster of Goons. So over to Kim.
Thank you, Janet, and I appreciate the invitation tonight. My husband and I lived in England for about 25 years and raised our children there. But his father was Maltese, and we decided to retire to Malta about 6 years ago. One of the biggest adjustments for me was not being able to easily go to all the conferences, lectures, fairs, record offices, and the like with my relatively newfound interest in family and local history. So it's really nice this evening to be with people who I know enjoy their studies as much as I enjoy mine. Now, let's see what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, we're going to talk about connections. Back in the summer, Janet Few wrote me out of the blue and said, "Hey, how would you like to talk at the conference about connections?" And I thought, "Oh, I've never talked about connections. What's that about? You know, I'm not sure." So I wrote her back, and after swapping a few notes, I said, "Oh, I get that. I like that stuff. Yeah, I'll do that." Now, along about late October, I thought I really better get serious about putting together this presentation since I've not done a presentation on connections. And I started looking back at all my old presentations on my one place and one name studies. And the more I looked, I realized that every one of those talks was about connections. So, Janet, my thanks to you for finally telling me what I've been talking about all these years. I didn't catch on to that. Anyway, we'll start with what these connections are, and then I'm going to go back into maps, which I know have been mentioned a couple times today, but they're pretty important to one-place studies. And then I've chosen a few topics of particular interest to me, but hopefully of interest to you too, including the military, prominent people, migration, and nonconformity, to show you examples of making these connections. And my intent with the talk is to give you ideas on the sorts of connections you might make and how you might record those connections for yourself and others. It may not be the same topics, but hopefully you'll get some good ideas. The examples for this pitch are drawn from my own one-place study of Bratton Covely in West Devon. It's on the southwest peninsula of England and is about 30 miles above Plymouth and about 10 miles east of the Cornwall border. So it's a beautiful area, and I actually, after hundreds of years of my family living in the States, I managed to be living in Taunton, Somerset, an hour away from Bratton Covely, when I discovered that parish was where my grandmother's Eastlake surname originated from. So I felt very lucky. Okay, what's the point? What's the point of a one-place study? I think that's actually a pretty easy question to answer in my simple world. We can study all kinds of stuff. So whether that's the history of families or the local history of an area or the landscape or the agriculture, whatever. But I think what we're all trying to do is really just to get a better understanding of our place, to build a picture of what life was like in our place within the bounds of however we've defined our study scope. So I think someone mentioned earlier, it might be a cottage, it might be a 50-mile stretch of land in Western Australia with multiple settlements. It might be a county in the United States, but within that scope, we can all pick and choose the sorts of things we're going to try to look into to build that picture of our place. Now, we make connections to do that. And the way I think about it always is connections between people, places, and events. You might call this something besides connections, and that's why I didn't really grasp it when Janet wrote to me last summer. For example, you might call it analysis and synthesis, or integrating data and drawing conclusions, or one of my favorites, being an IT type, transforming data into information into knowledge. But basically, we're just trying to connect the dots we've collected into something that tells us more, something helps us to better understand our place. So let's look at these connections just a little bit more. People, all kinds of things. Obviously, you want to know who lived in your place. Mine happens to be an English parish, by the way. But you might want to know about the clergy, or the prominent families, or the farmers, or the criminals. Lots to choose from there. And the nice thing about a one-place study is you can choose exactly from that list, or a much longer list, exactly what interests you the most. Places. What are the specific locations within your parish? Now, these are really important because this gives you that spatial element to your study. In my case, the manor and the manor properties are of interest. The farms are critical. The little village residences, institutions like the things Janet talked about with churches and chapels and schools and some memorials and landmarks, as well as transport systems. And with both the places and people, we're trying to connect them with things that actually happened in the parish, in the place. Events such as marriages, burials, and baptisms, military service, wills and probates, fairs and local events, any number of things, again, that you have the luxury in a one-place study of picking what's of interest, most interest to you. And thinking back to Anna's presentation, of course, we want all of these bases for connections to come from robust and documented sources. So the other aspect of this is not just making the connections, but you can find the connections, but we really have another key task, and that is to capture or describe the connections you've found. And just like the connections themselves, the things you're going to dig into, you have a huge latitude in how you're going to express those connections. So people who like to write might choose to capture their connections in stories. And stories are great because people remember stories. I think our brains are built for stories. Others are real picture people, and pictures evoke emotion. Pictures stick in our head very nicely and capture a lot in a very succinct way. Maps are particularly important. I'm going to come back to those in a minute. And I'm just going to mention charts and tables. For some of you, I think your school days in math scare you away from that area, but I happen to love charts and tables because I find that they're so helpful when I want to compare what I'm finding with what other researchers are finding. In addition, I often spot things by looking at charts and tables and maps that I might not recognize before I've actually looked at those things and visualized it. So you have all kinds of choices on how you're going to describe your connections. And I think Karen will come back to that when she talks to you about publishing and sharing your information. I want to start with maps again. I know that both Janet and Anna have mentioned them, but to me, they're just absolutely the key to the connections you're going to make to your place. So these maps are to dig into the specific locations in your parish or in whatever boundaries of your study there are, where you're going to be able to connect things spatially. And it's a wonderful way of visualizing a lot of information. It's a wonderful way of capturing a lot of the connections you make. In England, the 1845 ties maps are a great place to start. and in Wales, since they often precede the Ordnance Survey maps. They have great spatial and socioeconomic detail in the tithe allocations, and they're getting easier and easier to access. Most of the other places we study also have some really good sources like this. I use land records, for example, when researching my ancestors in the States. And I've seen some very good, wonderful property maps from Australia and the like. Now, I sat down years ago and traced the tithe maps. They were not digitized in Devon at that time. Maybe they are now. And then I sat, and I know others at this conference have done the same, and colored in all the little fields. In my case, in my parish of 8,000 acres and 2 detached parts, there were 2,500 fields in order to find the farm boundaries. And I've gone back time and again to these maps to organize the information that I'm finding as I make my connections. So I can't stress enough to try and find a really detailed map fairly early where you can start to have a picture like this of your place if you don't already have one. Once you have that, you have a way to place the dots you've found, whether it's a chapel or a prominent landowner or soldier, into some sort of picture that can be quickly grasped and may even highlight something new. Like I put all my Methodists on one of these maps, and I found just by looking at it, I realized that all the ancient manor lands in the center of the parish that had historically been farmed by tenant farmers mostly remained as an Anglican stronghold, while it was on the boundaries of the parish that Methodism and nonconformity grew. So it can be full of surprises. Now, don't stop at things like the Ordnance Survey maps, because there's lots of surprise. Oh, this is also, let me mention this on the tithe map. The other thing I did, the most populated area of my quite rural parish is a little village, and others of you will be studying heavily populated areas. But this is on my website, and I was able to trace the village detail from 1845, and I captured the description of each place and the owner and tenant at that time, and then with the help of a friend in the parish, we were able to connect them with the modern names of those places if they still existed. So there's an awful lot you can do with it. You might instead just add pictures of the houses, the dwellings. I'd love to do that someday if I find time. You might add whole house histories to this sort of thing. Just use your imagination. That's the most important thing in making connections. Now, other types of maps. Don't stop at the standard maps. Other real treasures could be tucked away in your local and national archives. So just look for maps from different time frames with as much detail as you can find. The earlier, the better. Estate survey. This is an estate survey map of Eastlake Farm, where my grandmother's name originated. It's one of the most beautiful and vivid maps. I don't think the photo quite does it justice, but it's a beautiful map that I'll really treasure. Now, I found that in a big box of solicitor's papers in the Devon Heritage Center, and it actually said, although the papers were not cataloged, it said in the catalog description that there were estate surveys in it. So look for estate surveys, look for property sales brochures, look for anything that you think might have a map, and try to grab hold of it. You might be surprised at what you find. And even with the map like this, there's lots you can do with it. For example, I wanted to know how stable the boundaries of my place had been. And so I took this map from the 1700s and I grabbed a satellite image from Google Maps today. And what I found was it really hadn't changed at all. It was so easy to spot all the fields from the 1700s. And interestingly, you might see up in this corner of this aerial view a reservoir creeping into this land. Now, that went in 1990 and is the largest freshwater supply in southwest England today. But fortunately, before they flooded the whole area with this big reservoir, a group who were the predecessors to what became Time Team on TV came in and did an archaeological dig of the area before the water flooded everything. And they found these hedgerows that are all over and that mark field boundaries. They found some of them dating back to Anglo-Saxon times. Now, I know East Lake existed in 1245 because it was in the Assisi roll. And I have a pretty good belief that this farm with these fields, very similar to today, may have existed all the way back in Anglo-Saxon times, which I find quite amazing. But anyway. Okay, anyway, the other thing is this particular map was my grandmother's farm, I call it. She was born in Arkansas, of all things, but this was her farm. And so do try and find personal connections. Sometimes it takes time to dig through solicitors' boxes and the like. So be sure you pick topics that really are of special interest to you. And keep in mind that maps can come in a lot of forms. So it may be historic maps, it may be hand-drawn maps, or it may be maps that have been produced by a variety of easy mapping tools that are available free online. Just keep an open mind and find all you can in maps. It'll pay off tenfold. And like Janet said, you spot place names later on, and matching the names of people and the like. Lots of things can come from maps. But it's a great organizing tool. Now, let's talk about some of the other topics that I want to dig into. First one I focused on was soldiers and sailors. And as I said, I like to choose topics that are special interest to me. So, and I always start with my granddad, Colonel Roy Blackman, who served 30 years in U.S. Army Signal Corps. My dad, Captain Donald Kerwin, who was a company commander in the U.S. Army Reserve during the Korean conflict, and my father-in-law, Chief Petty Officer Smudge Smith, who spent 40 years on Royal Navy submarines. And I'll also mention that my granddad here, the Colonel, many decades ago swore me in as a young computer officer in the U.S. Air Force. So Anna, I wonder what the odds are that we have 2 U.S. Air Force veterans speaking at this conference. I find that really quite amazing. I'm still adjusting to the notion that you weren't even born when I did my service, but I'll have to get over that. Okay. I like researching soldiers and sailors because there's lots of sources for them of every kind: records, mementos, pictures, memorials, and there's so many stories to discover so that we don't forget these people. Now, I was very lucky to meet Mary Palmer Jordan in my parish as about the first person I met in the parish, and she was the font of all historic knowledge in the parish, having been the postmaster for our mistress for many years, and her family actually was postmasters in that parish for 150 years before it closed in the early 2000s. Sadly, Mary died couple years ago, but she lived in the old post office, and we'd occasionally drop by and see her and Reg. And one day she decided to dig into her cupboards. And in her cottage, the old post office, she had more mementos and history of the parish than you could possibly imagine. So while Mark, my husband, spent all day just snapping photos of everything, we got to talk a lot about some of our ancestors, which was a family of Palmers during World War I, and 5 boys in the family went off to war. Now, Nicholas here died in 1917. He was killed in action. But she had pictures of Nicholas. He's the one with the dog. They were rabbit hunting, I was told, probably at one of the Society for One Place Study conferences. But you could find all kinds of things about him. His baptism record, census records where he was a young postman living with his older brother and his grandmother, his memorial on the Commonwealth War Grave site, and even the memorial medal that they gave to his family when he was killed in action, and of course his service records. So I had all this information on Nicholas, and I went and dug further into his his family, his parents, his service time, his burial information, and I put it all together, as I always do, into a spreadsheet. And very simply, I just made a booklet out of it. It's on my website. I did this a long time ago. And that grew into, that spreadsheet grew into all the fellows in Bratton Clovelly who had served in, who had either died or served at all in World War I. That grew into World War II as well, and back through the 19th century and all the way back finally to a muster roll in 1599. So I had many hundreds of soldiers and sailors who had some relationship to the parish, and just had the little booklet, and I got a lot of contacts from that, by the way. There was a lot of people keenly interested in their soldiers and sailors. But that was a very easy thing to do. There's other ways to express the connections you might find about soldiers and sailors. One of the things, Mark called me over when he was snapping the photos. He found that Mary had brought out an autograph book of Edith Palmer, who was the sister of these 5 boys who went off to World War I, and she was a teenager at the time. And on the last pages of this autograph book, there was this picture, and Mark said, "Hey, take a look at this." And I immediately recognized that A. Bowles, who drew this picture, was also on the World War I memorial, and he died on the Somme in 1916. But this tells us that Edith was his sweetheart, and it looks like they were quite serious. And in fact, Edith, although she lived a long life, she never did marry. And there was also a wonderful photograph of him in the book, in his uniform, and a beautiful poem on the back. And my guess is that that was a card that was perhaps passed out when his funeral was held. So if you can find a picture to connect to your soldier or sailor, it's worth an awful lot. Or you might choose to write up something. I actually borrowed this from my one name study, where I wrote up a little blurb on each of my Roll of Honor guys in my Eastlake one name study. And that's another one that sticks with people. In this case, I was able to look at the war diaries and really find out more about the circumstances of their death. I'll also mention a really wonderful source if you're doing something like this. Imperial War Museums, if you're researching soldiers, British soldiers and sailors, has a huge, vast store of photographs that you can use freely if you just give a small citation on where it came from. So lots you can do if you like to write. But you can go further than just about the individual soldiers and sailors. You can abstract the information. And I enjoy this part. So for example, and I've got a whole little booklet on examples of this for this military group. I just came up with a bunch of questions that I was interested in and put together the data to do this. Very simple tools. The challenge is in asking the right questions and coming up with the questions rather than actually figuring out how to display them. But I found that if the war had gone on another couple of years, we probably would have had grandfathers being mobilized. I found that the soldiers and sailors that went were from all walks of life and from almost every farm. Actually, and it wasn't just, I actually had one female who showed up on the 1919 absentee military list, and she baffles me because she was a very, very wealthy 58-year-old mother of 2 who I'm sure had never worked a day in her life, and for some reason she was an absentee military voter. I have no idea what she was doing for the war effort, but anyway, that's a mystery for me. The other one that I found very interesting and really quite sad, and it matches, build context around these things, read and find out nationally what the statistics are and more about your basic history of the conflicts. But in World War I, almost 70% of the young men of the right age went off to that war, and almost half of them either didn't return or they came back wounded or with other medical conditions. For example, dysentery was a big one. So I found that really quite overwhelming, and it matched pretty closely with what they found nationally. So lots of stories to be found amongst these fellows. Okay, let's turn to another topic, prominent people, the notables. Again, I chose this because every place has them, and sources abound for these folks. My place has hardly any gentry. It's quite a farming community. You'll find cattle and sheep, but not much else. But we did have a manor, and this manor was built in, that you see here, was built in 1857 by the last manor lord, Thomas Ellis Manning. And you can find all kinds of information on him. He's really quite recent. So, for example, wonderful sales brochure that detailed a page for every single plot on this map, what each of these properties that within the manor had on the land, who was tenants on them, and the like. And you find other influences of these prominent families elsewhere. For example, they're memorialized in the stained glass windows that Thomas Ellis Manning's widow, Elizabeth, put in as the main benefactor of the parish church. So very easy to find information on these people, and they almost inevitably have interesting stories. Thomas Ellis Manning started as a stationer in a small area of North Devon, so he did rather well for himself. I then thought, well, I want to know more about all the manor lords and ladies. And for those of you studying in England and Wales, the Manorial Documents Register project led by the National Archives did a lot of work in recent years on descent of the manors, and hopefully those should be available at your record office. In my part of the country, Kim Taylor Moore did those descents, and she contacted me when she was working on the Bratton Covelli one. It was really interesting to talk with her. She was able to figure this descent out within a few days. I'd been trying for a couple of years and hadn't quite got it, but she was a medievalist and knew a lot about manors. So stay in good touch, find this information, and once you have it, these are big prominent landowners on the left-hand side of this chart. Probably none of them lived in Bratton Covelli itself. But when you get into the 1400s and with the starts of the like of Robert Kirkham, they start being the prominent local landowners, resident in the community. Now, by that time, the manor, the whole concept of manors was starting to fragment. And it was really interesting. When you're working with manors, you need to do a lot of contextual reading because there'll be a lot of terminology and the like, a lot of new concepts. So do a lot of contextual reading and you'll get a lot more out of what you find out about your manor. I looked at another, pick any individual, any of these guys. William Wimpy was the lord of the manor in the 1700s, and the manor had fragmented before he came around, but he had money from his dad, and he started reamassing or reassembling the manor in the mid-1700s, and he did a pretty good job of it, and there's lots of information on him. The property brochures, again, give so much information, but there's even a book called Red Spider, written by Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, and you may know him as the writer of The Onward Christian Soldier hymn, but he was a very prolific writer. And Red Spider was based in Bratton Covelli, and he actually borrowed, his father preached at Bratton Covelli Church, and they had lived in the area, and he used surnames and the like that were known in the area in his novel. So William Wimpy was undoubtedly Squire Impey in Sabine Baring-Gould's book. But the other one, the real discovery I had, was William amassed all this property, spent half his life putting together this manor, and he died intestate. So when he died, his lands, everything he owned, all these manor lands, and a hugely wealthy fellow, went to a distant cousin, Joseph King. Now, Joseph died 2 years later. And before you know it, his kids are in court. And I got an abstract, a huge abstract of these court cases that went on for years after William and Joseph's death. And it turned out this abstract was brilliant because it had every owner or every tenant of all these manor properties, about half the properties in the parish, and throughout the 1700s into the early 1800s. But then when I got very near the end of the transcript, Joseph said in it, in a case, he said, and by the way, if William's properties amount to more than 10,000 pounds, which they certainly did, then I want this amount to go to William's housekeeper, Joan Exworthy, and their 4 children. And I thought, oh, wow, okay. And that explained, I found them in the baptism records, one of whom actually was identified as having a father of William Wimpy. But years later, when the court case finished and they had to sell off the manor lands, some of those Exworthy kids changed their name to Wimpy, so I'm sure they were successful in the case. I've only read part of the papers, but I am going to find the remainder of them. So you can find out all kinds of stories from looking into these prominent people. But I wanted to go further. Okay, I wanted connections back into the early centuries because my own family left for Bermuda and then the States right around 1600. So I was interested in the 13 to 1500s. And we spent about 3 years working with a wonderful fellow named Brooke Westcott, who translated 10 Bratton Manor rolls and gave us untold numbers of names and more information on the manor. And I did a video on that specifically, which is listed here. But this was an incredible source for us. First, pull out the information on the individuals. You know, what were their occupations? Where were they living? You could find this stuff in the rolls for a lot of people. What roles did they have in the manor? Were they the reeve, or were they the ale taster, or the like? In this case, I did a really simple thing and just took the names of all the jurors, threw them into a Wordle tool online, and got a distribution of the surnames of the jurors. And you can see Estlake right there, and probably many other recognizable Devon names. And a lot of these names also relate to the names of my farms in my parish, which is always very interesting to find. But you can go further than that. So there weren't many women. Almost all the adult men were mentioned in the court rolls. But I had 60 court sessions, so even if only 7% were of women, that I had a lot of actions. And I found that women were very active in the community in the 1300s to 1500s. And it really started changing my view rather strongly of feudal times. But they could bring complaints to court. They were complained about. One had the role of ale taster as a role in the manor. They could lend and borrow money. They could work for wages. They could claim when they weren't being paid properly. So women were never, I can't believe that women were ever tucked away in their cottages. I think they were had the rights and responsibilities just like everybody else in the parish, and were very active in the community in many ways. The next topic I looked into, and there's been some talk of population. I believe Janet brought that up, or maybe Anna. And I was very interested in population and migration, and this is another one for connections, but another one where you need to build context. So find out what was happening nationally, find out what was happening regionally. In the case of England, in the first half of the 1800s, really from about 1780 on, the growth rate started to explode, and the national population was rising very rapidly. Plymouth, 30 miles below Pratt and Clovelly, was exploding as a dockyard, okay, and it's a very large place today. And at the same time, my little Pratt and Clovelly had their population decreased by 50% between 1841 and 1900. And I wanted to find out why. So I dug into this, and the first thing I did, which has made a huge difference, and this I think is a wonderful set of connections that will keep me busy for probably the rest of my life. I set the censuses side by side conceptually. I just put them, here's the 1841, 1851, 1861. And just like you do for your direct ancestors, I started connecting all the residents in Bratton-Covelli to all the censuses they were in. And I came up with 3,000 residents in the parish between 1841 and 1911. And with this linkage, I could tell so much about the people. So for example, I started then to connect in baptism and burial records, so I could tell who was born and who died, you know, who disappeared from the parish. I then went after the others who must have migrated, the ones who left the parish, and I was able to easily track down a lot of local migration because Devon and Cornwall records are very good online. But I also was able to find a lot of overseas immigrants, both by censuses or electoral lists or the like, but also by finding good quality family trees and actually getting in touch with families that had immigrated. So there's many active family historians, for example, in Australia, and I enjoy some good relationships with them. So it's possible to get this picture of the ebb and flow, and you quickly see that in Bratton-Covelli, while the population decreased by 20% between 1841 and 1851, that was primarily due to migration, internal migration or immigration. Now I took this further and I borrowed from a fellow named Colin Pooley who got all the data from 15,000 family historians and set them all up in this kind of structured analysis. And this isn't exactly what he did, but the idea is that you put it into a form that you can compare with what others have found. And you use things like age bands and distance bands and the like to make it quite flexible. So you can use it as a basis for comparison. But I found out a lot more about who stayed in the parish, who left the parish, and who came into the parish. And it's very interesting, and I've now done that up through 1911. And I found that although the national theories were saying that it was all young single men leaving for the economic centers or leaving overseas for the United States, that just wasn't the case at all in my parish. It was young families with a lot of children and that who were going overseas, and they were mainly going to Canada. And I found that for internal migration, it was all very local movement to other rural communities, which were simply tenant farmers, agricultural laborers, and servants looking for work as close to home as possible, and many of them never going beyond 5 or 10 miles. I also looked at where they came from and where they went to, and this is how I could see that only a handful went on down to Tavistock, a town, or to Plymouth, another big city economic center. Most stayed very local, both where they came from and where they went to. And I looked at, okay, how did they affect this 20% to 50%, what became a 50% drop in population between 1841 and 1901? And I found that of all things, while their population between 1841 and 61 dropped by 20%, the adult workforce actually slightly increased in that time. They certainly didn't lose any farmers, agricultural laborers, or tradesmen. What did happen was the young unmarried people all worked as servants, and so living in with their employers. And that's what flexed in a time like this, when they had a huge population from the growth in the first half of the century. They had too many young mouths to feed, so all the young servants went, and they didn't have to go too far to other areas where there was enough work for them to be employed, and they could get the Bratton Covelli population back down to something that the 50 farms in the parish could support, because for geographical reasons and the like, they could not use alternative industries. So it was a really very interesting story to be told there. And I even found then that who they immigrated with. I was looking at overseas immigrants, and they tended, I found a number of these big kinship groups who immigrated together. And this led into, this happens to be the Allens. Thomas Allen was led a Wesleyan society in Bratton Covelli, and he migrated with his big family and Ken, as well as the rest of his little Wesleyan society. They all took off for Ontario, Canada, I think in 1842. And they were all called Allen, and it turns out these Allens were all from a place called Sutcombe, Devon. And the story is that 4 Allen brothers married 4 unrelated Allen sisters. And I had to laugh when they got to Canada, darned if they weren't still having Allen marriages in Canada. So life went off much like the homeland, the motherland, when they got to Canada. But all these people were going looking for land. But what this led to, I knew that Thomas was a Methodist. He was a Wesleyan. Most of the people in my parish were in a denomination called Bible Christians. And I got very interested in nonconformity, which is basically Protestant denominations that are not Church of England. And in my case, it was these Bible Christians, which was an offshoot of Methodism. And it only came to my parish, nonconformity only came to my parish in the 1800s. So there's a lot of quite recent, relatively recent history on it. So there may be a lot of built heritage for if you look into nonconformity. And I have wonderful pictures of the 4 chapels that were in the parish, and one of them is still a Methodist church today, and 2 only closed in the past decade. They all lasted at least 150 years. So you can place those and get your images of them. Then you can do a simple thing. We have a Methodist cemetery, and the graves start quite late in the 1890s, so they're actually quite easy to read compared to the big parish church. I've got loads of images of them, but it's going to be still probably a couple of years before I get those all sorted. But I was able to look at about, 120, 150 burials in the Methodist cemetery. And I went ahead and picked up all their information, found out who they were, who their parents were, who their spouses were. I was trying to understand when they became nonconformists, because nonconformity was in its infancy in Bratton Covelli in the early 1800s, and it only grew over time. And I was able to connect them, obviously, with all the gravestone pictures that my husband took in several visits there. Then I went on and said, hey, there's lots of names in this cemetery who have the same name. And I was able to find lots more kinship relationships by trying to connect up who was buried in the cemetery with other people. I got 4 generations of this Glass family, and considering there's only about 120 years worth of gravestones in that cemetery, I felt very lucky with that. But I found all kinds of connections between families, and I was able to make more sense of the spread of Methodism in my particular parish. So I think that was a really fun topic to research. And of course, from there, again, I tried to abstract from the detail and paint a more general picture so I could make some more general observations comparable with other researchers. And I found in the mid-1800s that my Methodist population was a very young population, big young families with lots of children, whereas the Church of England population was much more aging. And so the Methodists, although many were immigrating overseas and they were losing congregations in England because of that, on the other hand, they were so many young families that they were having far more births than deaths compared to the Church of England population. So that was fueling still quite a lot of growth in England and Wales. I also looked at occupations and found in my parish, which was not necessarily the same experience in other parishes I looked at, was that initially Methodism was quite attractive to agricultural laborers, but over the course of the latter 1800s, it became much more popular with farmers, I think because of changing social legislation, the changing social status of nonconformity in general, and the church, the minutes of the school board and the like are full of very interesting struggles about church versus chapel, or Church of England versus nonconformity. And I found it extremely interesting to do a lot of contextual reading on what was happening with both the Church of England, which was doing a lot of change in response to nonconformity, but also what happened with the nonconformist denominations. And from this, knowing that now I had Bible Christians going to Canada and in large numbers as immigrants from my migration and nonconformity studies, way back in, I think, 2014, Janet and I did a joint presentation at a Society for One Place Studies conference where we showed that what she was finding in North Devon was very similar to what I was finding in Bratton Clovelly. And with that, those comparisons, we could really begin to have some well-evidenced generalizations for an area significantly larger than just the little individual places we studied. So that's what I really love to get to with connections. Now, I just want to finish with this, and I've mentioned context a number of times, but I really encourage everybody to build a context diagram that's for their place. Now, you start with the connections like we talked about, whatever sorts of things you want to focus on with people, places, and events. But then your broader reading and your broader connections, you just need to start building your understanding around this picture. So whether it's geography or the church, what's happening in church and chapel, or the schools, I got very interested in finding out lots more about feudal times and manor life, demographics, economy, whatever. You build the picture that makes sense to you. But I think with connections, you can get what happened in your community and you can organize that information. But with the context, I think you're starting to try and answer places like, okay, why is my place like this? Is my place like other places? And I think that leads you to further and further routes to explore and possible connections in the future. And with that, let me just say, I think the whole intent here was to try and show you possibilities of the sorts of connections you might make. And my view is that as the more and more connections you make, this is your one place study. The connections, making the connections are your one place study. And if you keep connecting and you keep connecting and you keep connecting, maybe someday you can step back and say, hey, I think I'm starting to get a feel for my place. And that's what I hope for all of you. Okay, thank you. Any questions? I'd also be interested in hearing from anybody who's researching their own connections and the sorts of topics that you're considering. I'm always in search of good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. I don't know about you looking for good ideas. I think you've given most of us enough projects now to last for several lifetimes. So thank you very much. I've certainly, got plenty to do now. Helen has put a comment in the chat about oral histories as a source from soldiers at the Imperial War Museum, and you referred to what was freely available at the IWM for soldiers, and she's added that as another potential source, so thank you, Helen. Any other questions for Kim, or are we all just completely shell-shocked?
Sorry.
No, go for it. I agree, it's absolutely fascinating. And the connections that are open to different people will, of course, depend on the nature of your places, that those who are researching an entire parish will have opportunities that those of us just doing a house or a street might not. But then those of us with smaller places can look at aspects that might get lost on the parish level. Right, Helen, how many years have you been studying before you started making these higher connections?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think I started my one place study in about 2012 or 13. And I think that it didn't take that long before I was interested in this stuff, but in these connections. I think I first did a transcription of the census records of my parish. And I think I added to that, I sat down and I was very fortunate to have baptism registers from 1555 all the way to the present day. So I felt very lucky, and I transcribed those. With those two sources, I could do a huge amount to get involved in these connections. Things like the soldiers and sailors, where, for example, Mary Palmer Jordan came up with the personal mementos, were very rare and just a wonderfully fortunate happening for me. We did go by the parish when we could, but I would have loved to have had more time to get actual stories from people, the oral histories, and to see mementos and spend more time with things like that. But mostly, I'm an online person, and I could very easily start doing the connections that resulted in stories or resulted in maps and charts and tables and the like. And I just love it. I joined a project with the Family and Community Historical Society to do the nonconformity work. I did a lot of the migration work as part of my advanced diploma in local history from Oxford, which I took that course right when I retired back 6 years ago. So I took the opportunity to join up with some other groups on my particularly big efforts. But I was working on these connections really from very early in my one-place study. And I recommend that you do, okay? They don't have to be fancy connections, okay? But you can certainly get your maps together and start placing things on farms or at houses. There's lots of things you can do you can do a cemetery. There's lots of things you can do without having spent years gathering data. I encourage you not to delay, because there's fascinating stuff to be found once you start down this route.
Thank you. And Alison has said that was a great perspective on a one-place study, and she gives her thanks too. How many times have you found that questions have arisen out of the connections that you've formed as part of this research, that it keeps going on and on?
Constantly. In fact, I have to say that I think my big turning point, and I really thank the Oxford course for this, because I knew what I wanted to do with people, places, and events. I even put it in my application for the course, but I just didn't quite know how to do it, and that course showed me how. But at that point, I had I could link up these people, places, and events, and that's when I did my census linkage. Now, from that census linkage, once I started I added in baptism records, and then I could add my burial records, and I could add my marriage records, I could add tax records, I could add records of migration, and it's just infinite, the possibilities. And with those sorts of connections, now that I know how to organize that, I can do that, and I can just add to it forever. And that's why I say I think the possibilities that it's opened up to me will last me the rest of my life, if I could just get enough time to work on it.
That parallel universe where there's plenty of time.
Yeah.
Margaret has added, A really helpful talk, Kim. Speaking as someone whose current one place study grew out of her third war memorial study. Thank you. One thing I've learnt from everyone's talks today is that I don't need to apologise for going down alleyways that interest me, such as laundresses, centenarians, irregular marriages, etc. That's absolutely true, Margaret. Just go where you like. There's so much data out there. Yeah. Helen has said, IT sounds like databases are key to these analyses. And Jane has said...
What was that?
She says that it sounds like databases are the key to these analyses.
Not necessarily. Spreadsheets, I think, are important. I would encourage people. Look, the Excel that would be useful to you for this can be learned in probably 3 days or less of little free online courses. You don't need to be a whiz at Excel. You need to know how to do things like formulas. But you can learn that, and that's just a few days. So I do not believe you need special tools. Do I use databases? Yes, I do, but I didn't for a number of years, and I still do a great deal of my work of that sort of charts and table type stuff, just using simple Excel spreadsheets and some simple formulas to help me kind of clean up dates or clean up names and the like. So my firm belief is that connections are gated by your imagination, not by the ability to use tools. Okay, if there's something you want to find out, you'll find a way to express it that works for you. And remember, it's not just charts and tables. You can express it in stories. You can express it in pictures, or you may draw something yourself. And even maps. I've hand drawn a number of maps. So don't be hung up by the sort of technical skills you need to do this. It's just not the case. What you need is the imagination to think about the questions that you want to try and answer, and then you go after the data to get answers to your questions.
Okay. Jane has asked, which aspects of your study particularly lend themselves to comparison with other studies?
I think anything that abstracts, that's why I was stressing that a bit. Anything that abstracts from the detail is what lends itself, in my view, to comparison with other studies. Okay, people love the individual information, so having spreadsheets or individual write-ups on each soldier and sailor, people love that. You get a lot of contacts. There's a lot of interest in that. So I think that's really important. But it's the ones where I kind of up-level a bit and say, hey, I think that, you know, most of my guys who migrated to Canada were Methodists, or I find out that my soldiers were, you know, X number of them were wounded or came back with other medical problems. That's the sort of things you'll find in other studies, and I pick up papers wherever I can. I'm not currently on an academic database, so I can't get a lot of academic papers. But whenever I am on those databases, I just ravage them for anything that might relate to my place, my study, because I want to compare with what other researchers have found. And it's the more generalized information that I find useful for comparison.
Thank you very much. And Mike, which is probably make the last question, has said, how did you find out where people had moved to in neighbourhood parishes?
Well, it's not really hard. Well, first of all, the migration work that I did was centered on the census years. And I think that the detail of the censuses made a big difference to me. So if you can do it, I think partially, I can extend it a long ways, I think, into the 1900s with the electoral rolls. But if you don't have some sort of detail like the censuses or BMD records or the like, it's going to be difficult. Now, the censuses are available, but also all the baptism records of Devon and Cornwall are online in either Find My Past for Devon or in the Cornwall OPC database, which is excellent for Cornwall. So I could really quite easily locate just about everybody in Devon and Cornwall who had either come into or left my parish. Where I had more difficulty is where parish registers are not online or are not indexed in other parts of England. And then I had to go online and do some searching to track down my overseas immigrants. I didn't find everybody, but I think I found, upwards of 70–80% of people. So it was a very, very large number of people I was able to track down.
Thank you very much. There's lots of positive comments in the chat about the inspiration and the ideas and the enthusiasm that's given them to people to go deeper in their own studies. So thank you very much. We'll have a break now and reconvene at 7:30, where Karen Bailey is going to enthuse us on how to share enthusiasm for our studies and spread the word. So we'll see you in 15 minutes.